Hi everyone, Whitney here and welcome back to my channel, Whitney ERD. I am here with Dr. Valter Longo, Director of the University of Southern California's Longevity Institute and my former professor. Thank you so much for letting us come in here and chat with you today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Valter just recently released the English version of his best-selling book, The Longevity Diet, which is based on years of research he's done here at USC on fasting and how it relates to aging and age-related disease. And before we jump into exactly what the book's about, I was hoping you could give our audience, for any novices, a little background on the research behind fasting.
Fasting has been around for billions of years. And my first research actually started in bacteria and yeast. Once you starve these organisms, they become very protected against toxins and they become very long-lived. So they, for example, in yeast, the starvation counterintuitively doubles the lifespan of these simple organisms. And in mice, we tested it first for chemotherapy resistance. So the idea was, it's a little complicated, but to make a long story short, the idea was the normal cells in the mouse will be protected from chemotherapy when starved, and the cancer cells would not be protected or may even be sensitive. We now consistently see mice that are cancer-free, or never by chemotherapy alone, never by fasting mimicking diets alone, but often by the combination of the two. And I think a lot of people are now appreciating the idea that combining not just chemotherapy, but a variety of cancer therapies with fasting mimicking diets is something very promising for the future.
What exactly is happening in your body then when you're fasting?
It depends how long you fast for, but at a certain point, after a couple of days of fasting, the body switches, runs out of sugar essentially, and at least the sugar that comes from the outside, and then it switches to the fat, and mostly the abdominal visceral fat as a source of fuel. And it breaks that down and it generates fatty acids, and then it generates something called ketone bodies, and you hear all the time now about ketogenesis.
Right.
So fasting is the original way to generate ketogenesis from the inside, essentially. It is a preferential visceral fat loss, and that's probably one of the few interventions where that fat loss is not accompanied by muscle loss and water loss, just because, of course, those happens temporarily, but then when you refeed,
Right,
all of that is regenerated and rebuilt, and the water goes back to normal. So, whereas with most diets, you lose all of these with these cycles of fasting mimicking diet and the refeeding, you only lose the fat. But of course, the effects are much wider than this. So in the clinical trial, we've shown effects on cholesterol, triglycerides, fasting glucose, blood pressure, systemic inflammation, C-reactive protein, and also a marker or risk factor for cancer, IGF-1. They seem to be able to distinguish between people that have a problem and people that don't have a problem. So people that, let's say, had a blood pressure that was very low to begin with, let's say a systolic blood pressure of 110, they didn't go any lower. But people that had 135 systolic blood pressure, they came down significantly. This is confirming what we suspected from my studies, that this is probably causing regeneration, multi-system regeneration, and is fixing what needs to be fixed. But if something is already working properly and somebody has normal blood pressure and normal cholesterol, etc., there is nothing to fix.
In the clinical trials, you've definitely seen improvement in risk factors, but looking towards the future, you've talked about cancer. What are some of the other diseases you think fasting and overall the longevity program can have?
I think it can really have effects on a wide variety of diseases. Why is that? Well, if in fact it's taking something, if I always use the example of you cutting yourself. So if you cut yourself almost anywhere, the system can fix it, right? Almost perfectly. So then you have to think about the possibility that that's the same on the inside, right? So if you have liver damage, if you have muscle damage, if you have heart damage, if you have brain damage. So it's possible that, at least to some extent, these fasting is the signal to fix what needs to be fixed.
I want to talk about how you took the research that you've done here on fasting and FMD, on not eating, and translated that into a guide on what we should be eating on a daily basis.
I really took what I call a 5-pillar system. The 5-pillar system, which includes epidemiology, and you know from the classroom, right? Epidemiology, studies of centenarians, clinical studies, basic research focus on longevity, and studies of complex systems. Multiple studies now are associating high protein diet with cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. And they associate the low carbohydrate diet also with a lot of problems and diseases and a shorter lifespan. And you know, for example, if you look out there, many, I would say 2/3 of the diets are high protein, low carbs, right?
Absolutely.
Right now,
it's very popular in the fitness and wellness community.
And so if you look at all the pillars, so the epidemiology excludes this diet and says that the low protein, high carbs, but good carbs, of course, you know, the carbs that come from legume, whole grain, and vegetables. It was just a matter of start testing hypotheses. For example, what happens if people have a high protein diet versus a low protein diet, and we were able to show that at least before age 65, Americans that have a high protein diet have a higher or much higher risk for developing cancer and overall mortality.
What you saw in the studies that you guys did was that when someone was eating a high protein diet versus a low protein diet, that obviously had more detrimental effects. However, if the protein was coming from animal or coming from plant sources instead of animal sources, that decreased the harmful effect of the protein. Why do you believe that is the case?
Yeah, decreased it mostly for overall mortality. There was not a big effect for cancer mortality. And you know, nobody knows.
So I remember from the article that you guys put out, it was a 4 times increased risk if you're consuming 20% of your diet from protein versus 10%. However, if it was from plant-based sources, that decreased the risk to 3 times.
Right, so not a big effect.
I mean, not a huge effect, but an effect.
An effect, yeah. But for overall mortality, went from 75% increase in the high protein group to 0 to no significant increase. So that made a big effect when you talk about you know, if you're gonna die or not and when you're gonna die. The amino acid content in proteins is different in plant-based sources versus animal-based sources, and so that probably, like say, methionine effect, leucine, some of the amino acids that regulate TOR, IGF-1, etc., the key genes that are accelerating aging, the plant-based protein could have very different effects on them. Then you look at centenarians, and then
this is one of my favorite topics, the blue zones.
And you ask the question, well, what do they eat? You know, and they don't eat a high protein, low carb diet. They eat a high carb, low protein diet.
You've got Okinawa, where it's kind of a common misconception that they ate a ton of fish. It was actually only about 1% of their diet. We've got
Loma Linda, Sardinia, you know, Calabria now is also part of these very long-lived zones. Greece, the great majority of these areas have a low protein, high carbohydrate diet.
More plant-based.
Mostly plant-based. They eat meat, but very little. Then you go to clinical studies, and I think here we don't have much on the topic. Mediterranean diet with olive oil or nuts being protective both for cardiovascular disease and cognitive diseases. Basic studies, you know, the Australians and a number of other labs have looked at what makes a mouse live longer, and sure enough, the low protein, high carb diet makes even the mice live the longest. 30 or 40% longer is the extension that you see by dietary manipulation.
That's huge.
It's pretty good, but more important is the fact that they develop a lot less diseases. So they live
So
longer.
focus on health span as opposed to just lifespan.
Yes, they live longer, healthier. 50 pillar is cars and planes, and
how these complex systems can be related to what's going on in our body.
it teaches fundamentals about something complicated like the human body, without the complexity of all the things that we don't know about the human body, right?
So what are the main premises of the longevity diet?
Low protein, plant-based, some fish a couple times a week, of course, watching out for the mercury, and then high nourishment. That's very important, particularly as people get older.
Why is it that the longevity diet allows for the consumption of fish but not animal products like eggs and dairy?
Because fish, if you look at the data and look at the 5 pillars, it comes up almost always positive. It's very common that people that have populations that have long lives, maybe they don't have a ton of fish, but they have fish in their diet. And so I think that it's hard to find a pillar that is against it. You also don't find clear evidence that extends your life. Also, I talk about the bad idea that the dietitian associations come up with these 5-6 meals a day. People start expanding and extending the number of hours that they're eating for. So now we know from the work of Sachin Panda and others that many people eat 15, 16, 17 hours a day. Mm-hmm. We also know that people that do that are now have metabolic disorders, have sleeping disorders, etc., etc.
So what are some of the benefits that we've seen of time-restricted feeding? Basically trying to get back to where we started, eating during light-dark cycles, eating during the day, as opposed to having 5 to 6 meals like you talked about, where it can kind of start spanning a much longer period.
Well, what is known that most people don't know is that you need to stay very close to 12 or 13 hours. Eat, let's say, between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. If you fast for 14 hours, well, that's great. You get into a little bit of a ketogenesis mode, and you get these effects of fasting, but it turns out to be just a bad idea. There is data that we talked about in class on gallstone formation, for example, and so people that regularly fast for 13, 14, 15 hours a day, they tend to have much higher levels of gallstones, and they need to have surgery. And also, there are multiple studies now showing that skipping breakfast is associated with increased cardiovascular disease and overall mortality. It's also important that people like what they eat, and that's where also the carbohydrates are important in this right way, because people are not going to abandon this. Most of our diets eventually are going to be abandoned,
right.
and so whatever effect you may get from them is eventually reversed, and oftentimes you even get to a worse scenario or a worse condition than you were in before you started the diet. So it's very, very important that eventually whatever diet is identified is something that people enjoy enough to be able to maintain in their whole life.
It's important that there's longevity to your longevity diet.
Exactly.
What is the amount of protein that you recommend for the average person?
I recommend about between 0.31 and 0.36 grams per pound. It is still considered to be sufficient, but is at the lowest level. I think the American Dietetic Association should really put out a warning, because there is really no data indicating that it is good for people.
Right.
So considering the possibility that it is so bad for people, there should be a warning to say, look, avoid this high protein diet.
I think a lot of people aren't aware of this research.
Yeah, I mean, most people are not aware. The result is that, you have these commercials. People are just bombarded with advertisement about how
how much
protein content,
right.
and so now in the mind of most people, protein is associated with a good effect.
So what would you tell someone from a fitness background, for instance, who says, I can't eat a low protein diet, how am I going to build muscle?
I would say lower it to the lowest possible until you start losing muscle mass. It looks like, doing 2 sessions in a day on a workout day of 30 grams of protein, so 60 total, will maximize muscle building.
Actually, you're saying that your protein recommendations should be sufficient for someone with an average exercise routine, and that if you are trying to achieve the muscle mass of, say, a bodybuilder, then you are likely doing that at the expense of your longevity and health.
Yes, you're going to do it at the expense of longevity.
When it comes to cancer patients who a lot of the time are experiencing cachexia, which is muscle wasting.
For people that have lost a lot of weight, in a lot of cases, we can't do the fasting mimicking diet. So the trick is to act early and try to have cancer-free survival before you get to the state where the person has lost a lot of weight. And also the other trick is to regain as much of the weight as possible in between cycles. Now we're trying to develop maybe supplements that don't promote cancer growth but promote weight gain. So we're working on that. Hopefully soon enough we'll identify it.
Now, if somebody wanted to longevity-proof their kitchen, what are your top 5 longevity-promoting foods?
Garbanzo beans and chickpeas.
Those are a staple in my kitchen as
well. Vegetables in general, like green peppers, olive oil. Yeah, it's a good one. Salmon is a good one. Also for the omega-3s. Tomatoes is a good one too. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about fasting mimicking diets, but we haven't actually said what a fasting mimicking diet is.
A fasting mimicking diet, so a diet that patients could eat and it will have the effects of fasting on IGF-1, IGF-PP1, glucose and ketone bodies. Those were the 4 markers that we were looking to change. It's based on all we said. It is a low protein, a low sugar, and high fat, certain types of fat diet.
So essentially, does it produce a ketogenic state by the end?
Yeah, it produces a very similar ketogenic state as the fasting does, as the water-only fasting. It takes a little bit longer.
So what would you tell to someone who says, well, if doing a 5-day fasting mimicking diet or a 3-day water fast is intended to get me into ketosis, why don't I just do a ketogenic diet where I get to eat a normal amount of calories every day?
Somehow people equate fasting with ketogenesis, meaning that they think that the ketone bodies are doing all the work, but that's never been demonstrated. The reason why fasting, like we were saying earlier, why it probably works so well, is that it's an opportunity to break down junk, recycle it, utilize it for fuel, turn on stem cell, turn on a developmental program, a fetal program, and then rebuild, right? Well, if you have a ketogenic diet, there is nothing to rebuild. There is nothing to break down. You got plenty of food, and the body just adapts to that and says, okay, well, I used to get food from mostly carbohydrates. Now I get food from mostly fat coming from outside.
So two things you're saying here. The calorie restriction that's part of either the FMD or a regular fast is essential for the beneficial effects. And secondly, we don't know at least that they are due to the ketones or to the ketosis. But ketosis it's something that's occurring, but we don't know that it is.
It's part of the program, what happens, it's part of the response to fasting. But we have no evidence that is the part that causes the longevity or any protective effects. I mean, there is some experiments here and there showing positive effects, but that is not the type of standard that we now have in our field. The standard that we have in our field is like, first, show me that you can make mice consistently live longer. Could the ketogenic diet, let's say a high fat, good fat, low protein, low carbohydrate, that's got potential. Will I do it? Absolutely not. Why? Because it's just difficult to maintain.
Doesn't sound very appetizing.
It doesn't sound appetizing. Nobody's ever done it, you know.
So in the book, you give an overview of what a fasting mimicking diet looks like. You kind of break it down with the macronutrients. But now you're also saying that people shouldn't recreate it at home?
Yeah, people shouldn't recreate it. We did that in Italy. We made the mistake in Italy. And then we started getting calls from doctors, from hospitals, from lawyers. And basically the complaint was, you cannot let people make their own medicine at home.
So how can they do the fasting mimicking diet then?
Well, they should do it with Prolon,
Okay, so
the Prolon FMD from El Nutra.
okay, so the overarching question that everybody wants to know when we talk about longevity, what do you think is the longest lifespan that humans are potentially able to attain if we eat a correct diet, exercise regularly, do monthly or yearly fasting or FMDs, and also have genetics on our side, because obviously that's important.
I think that realistically in the book I talk about 110 years of age healthy. So
On average.
On average. Not easy, but realistic. Yeah.
Do you think you're going to make it to 110?
I mean, Caruso in my parents' hometown made it. Emma Morano just died earlier in 2017, and she was 117 years of age. So, you know, when you see them, you realize they're very rare, but you also realize it's very possible to get to their age. And so, obviously, I hope I'll give it a shot. You know.
I hope I do too. Well, thank you so much, Valter. I really appreciate you chatting with us today. If people want to learn more about you and your research, where can they find some information?
Two places, Prof. Valter Longo, Prof. Valter Longo Facebook page, and then createcures.org, which is on the cover of the book, the foundation, and yeah, soon enough we're also going to have valterlongo.com. So those two places, and
you can get the book on Amazon in English and in Italian as well. Correct?
Italian, in Spanish, in Portuguese.
All the languages.
Yeah, Polish, Russian, Chinese.
All right, and you guys can also potentially win a copy of this book. I'm going to be doing a giveaway right here on YouTube, and I'll put the details down in the caption. So if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more evidence-based nutrition information. I'm Whitney. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Valter.
Thank you. Thank you.